Now, on to the lecture. That's the reason why we're all here. So the title, of course, is Berlin Intersections, Issues of Jewish Art in the Early 20th Century. And Dr. Celka Straughn joined KU Spencer Museum of Art in 2009 and serves as the Andrew W. Mellon Director of Public Practice, Education, and Research. She is also a co-investigator of the Spencer's Integrated Arts Research Initiative and with the College Art Association's Resources for Academic Art Museum Professionals. In addition to her museum work, she teaches courses for KU's honors program in undergraduate studies and is affiliate faculty in German studies. She received a PhD from the University of Chicago. Her dissertation and related publications examine Jewish art and Expressionism in early 20th century Germany. In 2015, she participated as a fellow in the Getty Leadership Institute and won the 2016 Social Justice Fellow with the Office of Multicultural Affairs at KU. Most recently, Dr. Straughn curated Civic Leader and Art Collector, Sally Casey Thayer, and an art museum for KU. That was in fall 2017, and she's currently working on a subsequent edited volume. Welcome, thank you for coming here, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Justina, for the very kind invitation, and thank all of you. Come on through, Sheila.
Come on this way, please.
And apologies to those whom I'll mostly have my back because I want to be able to see my notes and see the slides. But hopefully you can all see, and is this functioning and everyone can hear me?
Sure. I think it's
okay, good. So what I'm going to share with you today, and I hope it will be more of a discussion and not a lecture, comes from my doctoral work. And I thought, oh, by focusing on Berlin, that'll help keep it concise. And then I realized the way Berlin is described for kind of Jewish art and Jews in the early 20th century is kind of as a throughway and collecting point, and that was actually how it functioned for my dissertation and my work. And so it permeates throughout. And then I'm like, oh, let's pull in this and pull in that. So I'm going to try to interweave a lot and hopefully not make it confusing. But please definitely feel free to interject. Like you're getting lost along the path. Just you have a question or just something you'd like to share because it's relating to some things that you're working on. Because I would love for this to be a discussion. And I'm going to try to kind of look at my phone to keep me on task because otherwise we'll be here forever. It says 10 o'clock there, so so that that will not be a good game. But we'll go until 1, so at least very least 10 minutes for some discussion. So if you could try to catch my attention. So just kind of. This was for my kind of doctoral work, and these are things that I continue to ponder, and Ari has heard some of this in another context, and thank you, all of you and my museum colleagues for coming out, and a number of you that I know, and good to meet those of you I don't know. For that work, I was really looking at the kind of motivations and the kind of social historical circumstances for a discourse of Jewish art. So I wasn't, and this is going to be reflected in how I'm using the images, which is not characteristic of art historians, in that I was really kind of analyzing what it was people were talking about when they talked about an idea of Jewish art. Where was it taking place? Who was talking about it? How were these ideas circulated? And that's harder to show in kind of single images. But Berlin was central to all of that. And I hope you'll kind of see that as I share things going through. And so that was kind of what I looked at. And I looked at kind of overlapping artistic, organizational, institutional, and political circles. I looked at artists, studios, and groups, obviously Zionism, various cultural groups, fraternal organizations, and avant-garde movements. And we'll kind of get bits of that throughout this afternoon or noon time's discussion. One of the things I'm continuing to work on and think about is how this discourse of Jewish art makes evident the complexities of art history and its role, kind of art history as a colonial discipline, and in affirming this idea of a nation state and its related institutions. And how does it kind of show some of the fractures of that and failures, but how is it in its use to kind of support institutions and people of power? And so those are kinds of things that weren't so much in my dissertation work and what I'm still kind of working with today. So Berlin in the early 20th century kind of was by then the capital of Germany. This kind of keeping in mind Germany, as probably all of you know, became a unified nation state in 1871. So relatively new, but kind of several decades to kind of establish itself with Berlin as the capital, becoming more and more cosmopolitan. You start to get important collectors and collections, a developing art market, and all of these are there and important because they provide opportunities for artists. And so artists start coming. And you get a description in 1910 by a painter, a man named Julius Rosenbaum, who described Berlin as soon possessing a Jewish artist proletariat, if it hadn't already yet occurred. And this is an article that appeared in a Jewish journal, Israelitisches Familienblatt, and he kind of was urging artists to reconsider whether they want to come, because among other things, it was difficult to sell your works. It was a challenging market, and more so is competitive, and even more competitive for Jews, because there were fewer collectors. Obviously, anti-Semitism kind of is at play, even though not directly named, not necessary. And those who were collecting maybe works by Jewish artists were also collecting works by Christian artists. And so a limited market. And therefore, it was important to think about how you positioned yourself. And that's something that's going to come up as we go through today. And one of the reasons why I chose this image of kind of, many of you, probably all of you, recognize the Brandenburg Gate. And kind of to the right here is where Max Lieberman, who is probably became one of the most famous artists in Germany in this period, lived. He was also Jewish, and both of those things come into play in the discussion. But the Art Academy was just over to the left, so a very central location. And so keeping that in mind. So let's see if I can get this. Okay. So I wanted to kind of start and kind of use this in a kind of introductory way in my dissertation with this kind of humorous poem by Sammy Groneman that really positions Berlin as a center of this thing being called Jewish art, and kind of questioning it and kind of how is it coming? How is it being disseminated? And I think it kind of gets at this kind of formative moment at the turn of the 20th century and some of the contradictions and complexities involved in this. And some of the people he mentions, I'm sure I know familiar to Ari, kind of figures associated with Zionism. And so relation to this kind of emergence of a notion of a potential Jewish nation state, or what is a Jewish nation, and why is Berlin an important place for this idea of a Jewish art to be propagated? There we go. Okay, so what we have here are an exhibition that actually took place in Basel at a Zionist Congress, but then a really important journal, Ost und West, that was published in Berlin. And both of these kind of have their affiliations with Zionism, obviously at a Zionist Congress. But at this particular Congress, not only was there this exhibition of works by Jewish artists, Martin Buber gave a really important speech on Jewish art and trying to figure out what this might be. And there's this tension, especially in the kind of early decade. Are there maybe just Jewish artists, but maybe not a Jewish art? How do those relate? What do these mean? Can we even call someone a Jewish artist? And if that's in question, how could you even call something a Jewish art? And so kind of what we're going to look at and point out are some strategies in how people were grappling this, but why they were grappling with it. What do you think? A kind of really important topic for conversation. Why would this be important? What do you think? You look like you had an idea.
Well, in this period,
Yeah.
the
Thank you, Nathan.
nation-state model is so dominant, at least among a certain strata of people, in this desire to belong and to articulate oneself as doing art for the nation. I mean,
Okay.
I find this
So
very,
art in service of a nation then,
Right.
okay, but a way of
I
belonging?
find this really complicated though, because I think art in this period is also extremely cosmopolitan, because people go to various art centers and they study there and they share their ideas, and so like nationalist art often to me seems smaller than art for art's sake,
Mm-hmm.
so it's kind of a trap in a way, for it seems, you know, if you want to be a modernist or an expressionist or whatever, or if you go to these museums, say a museum in Prague now, or a museum in Krakow, or a museum in Budapest, you see very similar looking art, but they're like ours, because their last name seems to match up with the national group, but
Mhm.
all of the art looks pretty similar. And I imagine it was really like doubly or triply tricky for Jewish artists, because there's less of a nation state that they can even sort of claim to be part of. So.
And you just
Yeah.
touched on a whole variety of points that come up in a lot of these discussions. But yeah, Joey.
I just wonder, I don't know anything about this historical period, but claiming art as Jewish art, does it then exclude that kind of work from being taken seriously in other modes?
Okay, and that was an issue that certain figures raised. If my work is associated as Jewish art, am I going to lose standing and maybe lose a market? But does that put me one level down? So yeah.
I imagine also amongst the Jewish community of Berlin, of Germany, or of German-speaking lands, or more broadly conceived, but it also sort of becomes a focal point for the tensions between these various groups, some of whom are going to be more Zionist-oriented and therefore want to actually assume this label as to suggest that there is a particular distinctive set of qualities or something that can be
Yep.
tethered to the notion of Jewish art, as opposed to the assimilationists, let's say, and that's not even one single group, but sort of more broadly conceived, who would view this label as a kind of stigma and sort of feeding into the rhetoric of anti-Semites in that sense too, who want to also believe,
Yep.
oddly enough, what the Zionists believe. That's a sort of separate
And that also gets in, and you get all of these discussions that you just shared are what gets circulated and raised in press reviews and in the newspapers and journals, and to the extent that one can capture, probably conversations happening among people as well. And so yeah, so at this moment, at this Zionist Congress, is a kind of an emergence of what's called cultural Zionism. And so maybe a culture that isn't tied to an individual land, but how do you create a culture? Because one, there was a kind of part of the arguments for anti-Semitic arguments was Jews lack a culture. And so if you lack a culture, then maybe you're not quite as fully a citizen. You are kind of one rung below. And something that's kind of been interesting me is how does art history and the development of the discipline of art history alongside the discipline of anthropology, how do those start to play? Art history is for that top tier of cultures and get art history and histories of art written about them. Other tiers of culture may be that anthropological, ethnographic lens. And so that opens up questions, where would, if your work is considered Jewish art or an kind of Jewish object, what kind of institution would it go into? And so all of these things kind of taking place, and Buber's kind of saying we need a culture and others, and kind of to have artists. And if we are recognized for artists, even if we're not even calling it a Jewish art, and this kind of other people will say, but that we have Jewish artists, and someone like a figure like Max Lieberman is recognized as an established artist, and everyone also knows he's a Jew, then that kind of gives some of that elevation. But I think a lot of what the issues that you've all raised really came to the fore in this exhibition in 1907, the exhibition of Jewish artists that took place in a really key location in Berlin. So the map here, you have, so Pariser Platz is up there that we saw, where the Academy and Lieberman's house is. And this is Wilhelmstrasse, and it was probably located further down somewhere here on Wilhelmstrasse, this gallery. And it was a brand new gallery. But you've got all these important ministerial buildings here. This is a really prime central location. Brand new art gallery, kind of the advertisements is like the latest fashionable styles for the newest way of installing and showing works. And it was chosen to really emphasize a notion of aesthetic quality. And for those of you in the museum world, talking about the quality of a work, and how do you determine what has quality? And these are things that the discipline of art history starts to do, and this language is developing. And so having a space and using the tools and strategy for emphasizing works by artists, hey, come on in, who were kind of known to be Jewish, and that they are producing quality works was important. And I just want to read, and this catalog had a kind of long essay and really kind of attempted to use the discipline of art history to kind of situate it and give a language for talking about Jewish artistic production. But in one of the reviews, Bertold Feivel in Die Welt, which is a Zionist publication, talked about the significance of the location in Berlin. It's a quote, "Lodged in a small little place in this city is the Jewish art exhibition, a little piece of flickering Jewish life, our life, embedded in this immense organism of teeming vitality." So kind of, but embedding it in what is becoming the commercial arts district of Berlin. So not in a kind of isolated Jewish location, but part of all of that. And who might be coming to it and trying to get kind of a wide range of press reviews that touched on all these very things that you were saying, kind of, and more. It created large intellectual debate. And particularly, I think something Nathan was saying about debates over national distinction and cosmopolitan European integration. And these are debates that weren't exclusive to Jewish art. It was about art in Germany at that time. Kaiser Wilhelm had very distinct and powerful notions of art and politicized the art scene. And this is a period where you have kind of Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, kind of modernist movements. They seem like foreign influences. He was wanting something, an art for a German nation. And what would you do if you have this? And Max Lieberman was associated with Dutch and French Impressionism. And so also being Jewish, therefore a foreigner, and you don't want these foreign influences in your national art. And these debates took place in the new National Gallery and how they were being hung. And Wilhelm did not like what the directors and curators were doing there for the most part. So this is the catalog, and this is some of the illustrations. And as you can see, kind of variants of kind of impressionist, post-impressionist portraits, variety of works. And so, as I mentioned, kind of trying to understand the works in terms of quality and kind of asking questions. Did Jews have a distinct modern identity that could be discerned in their art? Or did modern mean assimilated? therefore participating in a universalizing cosmopolitan culture unmarked by Jewish particularities. But if you saw in the opening room there, you did have this central place, and this is where the opening reception took place, kind of with Judaica and Jewish ritual art. And next to that was a room that was hung, and this is a quotation from one of the reviews, if one may say so, the Jewish paintings of the exhibition. And these were paintings symbolizing, quote, the suffering of the Jewish migration, the deep joys of a strong faith, the struggle between older and younger generations, the horrors of pogroms. And the organizers kind of thought, okay, well, if you have this clearly Jewish section, then maybe you could start to discern certain Jewish elements that you could then find in the other works by looking at the quality and looking at these kinds of style elements. And the goal was for the art public to kind of come up with characteristics for what might be a Jewish art. And this is a really important painting, Samuel Herzenberg, and becomes quite iconic. It is now lost. But this notion of exile, and you get a lot of images of wandering, and it also kind of is that east-west connection, but symbolic, and what became this section, the organizers called Kunst der Heimatlosigkeit, so art without a homeland, for a people without a homeland. But then this notion of culture rooted, kind of coming from agriculture, so rooted in a land. What do you do? And might think about it, kind of been thinking about this, the exhibition that we have, one of the major special exhibitions right now at the Spencer, The Ties That Bind, and kind of in conjunction with this year's Common Book and the immigrant artist. So kind of thinking of these notions of migration and where art fits and when you don't have a land. So we have the artist here, Hermann Struck. And I like that we have these kind of two portraits that he made because they also kind of speak in some ways to him. Struck was well known as being a very pious Jew, kept Sabbath, but was also really well known as a very important archer, and particularly in terms of printmaking. Wrote a very influential book on the art of etching, had lots of students come through. Pretty much anyone in Berlin who really wanted to learn printmaking kind of came through his studio. Sammy Groneman, who I kind of cited earlier with that kind of poem, kind of described him as, he is the strangest mixture of a fakir, kind of which in German gets used as someone who's a mystic, and a bon vivant that one can think of. And he was really known for being very funny and having a fantastic sense of humor. Another writer, M. Friedeberg, kind of in an article wrote that Struck was considered a rare example of a faithful believer among Jewish artists in a major Western metropolis. And in this writer's opinion, that put him at a disadvantage as an artist. So something that you were raising. But his position, both being a very established artist in the German art world, but then also this very religious, observant Jew, kind of gave him status in both worlds. And just kind of an aside, because we'll be hopefully getting to kind of Weimar and World War I. Struck kind of, this book that he did with Arnold Zweig, The Face of Eastern European Jewry, really kind of spoke to and kind of came to represent for Jews on the Eastern Front, that connection with the older generation, with a kind of traditional what was seen as the traditional Eastern European Jewry as opposed to the modern cosmopolitan Western. So I just wanted to point that out. But what I want to really emphasize is his studio, which is a space that all sorts of people came into contact. One writer, Karl Schwarz, who was a major art historian and curator and became director of the first Jewish museum, wrote, In his studio, there was a constant coming and going of all sorts of different people. The studio, which occupied several rooms, was less an artistic workplace than a consultation site. The visitors were received according to different categories in the individual rooms. There were artists of every type, in particular lots of Jewish artists, writers and journalists, several theater people and musicians. Then again, rabbis, Zionists, and lots of East European Jews, people who came for artistic and Zionist political reasons, but also lots of Schnorrer, so East European Jews, a motley society. And then we have 2 young artists, and many young artists came, young Jewish artists, particularly those maybe coming from the East, whether part of Germany at the time or further east, would come to Struck because they would also come to Max Lieberman, but a very different kind of studio. But Max Lieberman had even more cachet. So Jakob Steinhardt characterized in his memoirs that Struck's house, kind of around 1910, was the central point for all young Jewish painters. And I just want to point out there were no groups of Jewish artists that you start in Berlin that I'm at all aware of. So you didn't have like a group that you could join. And access to the art world really, like in a lot of things today, depends on your connections. And so making connections with prominent people would help give you introductions, not just to collectors and dealers, but also for fellowships, stipends, things like that, because it's not easy to survive as an artist, and it became more challenging, especially after World War I and in the Weimar period, as you can imagine. But 2 people that met there that I focused a lot of attention to and whose work really kind of drew me to these questions were Jakob Steinhardt and Ludwig Meidner. And Steinhardt, I kind of mentioned earlier, kind of among the people he met were Meidner, Samuel Herzenberg, who's Wandering Golus we saw, Regina Mundlach, and he found Meidner among his most interesting. And Meidner also wrote, and both of them came from Silesia, so I don't know who's presenting on Silesia later, but kind of found that bond. But Meidner wrote, I had the good fortune at Struck's to make the acquaintance of some important men. For example, the Grand Rabbi Max Lieberman, who etches together with Struck. He has done some very wonderful etchings. I further came to know another fine man, Dr. Alfred Kerr, whom Struck etches at the moment. Also, I made the acquaintance of 2 Jewish writers, Ruben Brananin and the very young Sholom Asch. And for Paris, where Meidner went after first being in Berlin, I have recommendations to Max Nordau and Alexander Marmarek. So kind of just an example of the kinds of things that could happen there. But these are kind of 2 works and keeping those in mind. But what really interested me was this exhibition that Steinhardt and Meidner came to form a group with another Silesian who's not Jewish, Richard Jantor, Die Pathetiker, and exhibited with Herbert Walden's Der Sturm. For those of you not familiar, if you have a kind of familiarity with modern German art, Walden's Sturm Gallery and Journal were critical to the development of what comes to be known as German Expressionism, both through the works that they showed, bringing in works of Cubists and the Futurists. Actually, kind of Futurists were introduced to Berlin through Walden and Der Sturm, as well as artists practicing in Germany. It was the way place for modern, creating a modern art. And their exhibition, many of the reviews really situated them, and let me get to their work, and trying to come up with, just like we've been talking about, trying to come up with a language of what is a Jewish art. What is this new modern art appearing in Germany, and giving it the name Expressionism and trying to characterize it and give it definition. So many of the reviews of their works were about that, trying to understand what is Expressionism, which is an emerging concept at the time. But one of the things that interested me, and this was kind of when I was doing my master's, I was doing an assigned project on Ludwig Meidner and his quote-unquote apocalyptic landscapes. And Meidner, you can see, died in 1966. He left Germany and escaped in exile in England and then returned to Germany. Steinhardt was able to escape and went and lived and remained in Palestine, Israel. And Meidner kind of got rediscovered, the story goes. He was at a talk on Expressionism and someone mentioned him and he's like, hello, I'm still here, I'm still alive. And so just to kind of say how to rehabilitate Jewish artists after the Holocaust and to get this, these discussions, because there wasn't much discussion after that. So lots of layers of kind of the historical circumstances to this discourse. But what interested me, and I've never seen this in person, unfortunately, I'm not quite sure who owns it, is, and it might be hard to see, but if you notice up in the upper left-hand corner of the sky, the cloud formations look like Hebrew letters. Not ever been able to discern something. Of course, I noticed it, and then it was like, oh yeah, someone else has noticed that before. So I was like, at least I'm not crazy and imagining things. But it's like, why? When these works were, and the way they were presented to me in my class on modern German art and Expressionism as works of Expressionism, and no mention of people, what their religious backgrounds were, ethnic backgrounds, anything like that. And then looking into these works. And there was really one review, and in a prominent journal, Die Action, which is also a kind of modern cultural journal at the time, and all of a sudden that writer's name just escaped me, that did situate these two artists and their works as Jewish in a very negative way, and really critique them. And so that's what kind of got me going and looking at why is this going on, how are these kind of going through, and why is that part not being told in the story of modern German art. Make sure, okay. So how then, because what started to interest me then was getting to this notion of Expressionism becoming, these two terms kind of developing, overlapping circle simultaneously. How do they start to come together? Because I started to notice that they did. Oops, is that, okay, I guess that's it. So I'll leave it on that for now. So then you have World War I, which I know several of you in this room are much more expert than I am. Happens, and obviously, as you all know, Germany lost the war. I know, sorry to break the news to you, Ari. Kind of intense inflation, really hard for everyone to survive. Very few people had money to buy art, so a real crisis for artists among everyone else. And you get an article in 1921 that says, Jewish art, ! More than the public commitment to a religion, the victory or the demise of a race as such lies in this naturally from Berlin emanating program. And this article was a bit sarcastic in ways too, and kind of critiquing it. But really what it encapsulated were many of the themes that come up in the Weimar period. An association of Jewish art with Expressionism. The identification of Jewish artists and by artists themselves, themes and characteristics of Jewish art. And this starts to become a period when you start to get histories of a Jewish art, or histories of Jewish artists first, and then a history of Jewish art. And an increasing number of exhibitions and exhibition reviews and publications. And Berlin becomes a really important publishing center in the Weimar period, not just for German publications, but Hebrew language, Yiddish language, a variety of Eastern European languages. And so works are kind of moving through and ideas circulating. Berlin becomes even more of a thoroughfare for Eastern European Jews. Even though you start to get the nation states, there still continue to be pogroms and a movement, not really people staying in Berlin, but moving further westward, or even more so emigrating also to Palestine. But spending some time in different durations of time in Berlin. So you also start to get an institutionalization of Jewish art in places for and support for Jewish artists. And so a number of different kinds of exhibitions. You get these fraternal and the sister organizations, the B'nai B'rith, start to have exhibitions, and that's kind of throughout the country. But you also get, and then this is where I'll go, the library and the Jewish Community Center starts to collect and create a space for showing works of art. And so collectors, but also creating institutional places to collect, so where everyone, the public, can come and see, whereas before it was more things entering into private collections. And you also start to get the writing about Jewish art takes a slightly different turn, and it's less emphasis on this cosmopolitanism, but really kind of trying to figure out what are some Jewish contexts. And when I kind of showed that book that Struck did with Zweig, this reconnecting, not a reconnecting, but forging this connection with this idea of the Eastern European Jewish ghetto. And that's where faith is preserved, and this creating this idea of this tradition. And the press started in Berlin, started giving more attention to artists from Eastern Europe, whose work was appearing more and more in exhibitions and publications. And artists from the Eastern homelands became increasingly identified as the real Jewish artists who produced a Jewish art. And starting to adopt more of the way that 1907 exhibition talked about a Kunst der Heimatlosigkeit, that Jewish art was about this kind of, these themes of wandering and exile, and that there are two different directions, and I think Nathan, it might have been you who mentioned, there was the assimilated art and there was the Jewish art, Ari. And so, because what is this Heimat, this notion, what can you connect to? And art needed to connect to something like that. And if you're assimilated, whatever assimilated means, and kind of parsing that, you didn't belong anywhere. And that was, again, an anti-Semitic critique, that you can't belong, so therefore. And you hear that still. It's that, well, they're just kind of repeating, I'm lacking the word, but it's just derivative art. They're just kind of doing like what the French did. They're just doing like what the Italian futurists did. And that continues to be a way of kind of declassifying artists from regions outside kind of Western centers. And so I wanted to kind of end with these two images. This is kind of the art collection of the Jewish community, which then grows into, and the opening date is at the beginning of January, is in January 1933, of the first Jewish museum in Berlin, showing works, and you can see Steinhardt's painting The Prophet, which I had shown earlier, that may or may not have been in the Die Pathetiker exhibition. So key works of kind of a modern Jewish art, as well as maybe kind of Judaica and more Eastern European themes. And the museum and the work that they were doing became increasingly important as the Nazis took power, and the opportunities that had grown over the course of the century for Jewish artists, albeit still very limited in comparison to Christian counterparts, obviously became fewer and fewer, and the challenges became greater. And a number of works that were here are now lost, destroyed. The story about Steinhardt's work was presumed lost and then eventually rediscovered. And if any of you have been to Berlin, the Central Judaicum that's now on Oranienburger Straße, in the synagogue there, is kind of trying to build up this museum and the archive and everything there. So that's kind of where it is today, and I think I've managed to actually leave about 15 minutes for discussion. So I'd love thoughts, questions.